Hello, my name's Christian Hunt and I'm the founder of Human Risk, a company that specialises in bringing behavioural science to ethics and compliance. And I'm here as part of Risk Awareness Week 2021 to talk to you about a decision-making dynamic that I think is not just relevant for those of us taking risk, but also for those of us trying to manage it. In fact, I go as far as saying that this is one of the biggest flaws in human decision making. What am I talking about? Well, let me illustrate it using this image of somebody you'll hopefully recognize. That individual is obviously Prince William. And what you can see from the picture here is that he is gesticulating to members of the media in not a particularly positive way. And of course, we know that the royal family has had lots of interesting media coverage, not always positive. So we might not be surprised to see that he is making a rude gesture to them. But if I pan out and show you the picture from a different angle, suddenly you'll start to see that what we might think of as a rude gesture is actually him being incredibly friendly. He is holding up a number of fingers to show a particular figure, and that figure is the number of kids that he's got. This was taken just after one of his children was born, and he's there celebrating that new arrival. Far from being a critical image, this is actually an incredibly supportive and positive one, but we wouldn't know that by just looking at the first image, and that is the human decision-making flaw that I want to talk to you about today. Now, in that particular example, it doesn't really matter that we don't exactly know what's going on, and we of course have the second picture to help us make sense of it all. But there are plenty of situations in which it might be a problem. Now, if I show you a classic pandemic example of this dynamic, you can start to think about the challenge slightly differently. What we see here is two Israeli gentlemen who are on camera talking to a news broadcaster. And that's what we can see on screen, all perfectly normal. Now, we all know that the reality of many of these presentations is that there's absolute chaos behind the scenes. And in this case, both of them are broadcasting from their children's bedrooms, and they were kind enough to share that on Twitter so that we could see exactly the conditions that they're operating in. Now, in this particular case, it is great that they are able to frame their presentations without any of those distractions. Seeing kids is, of course, delightful and cute, but if you're trying to do a serious interview on television, you probably don't want that to appear on camera with you. And so in this particular case, what they've done is curated a world that is the world that we expect to see. We don't think about the rest of their environment, and even if we did, we can't necessarily ever get to see it. It doesn't really matter. But if we think about lots of other risk dynamic situations where we don't have all of the other information and yet perhaps should, we can start to see that this becomes a little bit of a challenge, because the human brain's capacity and ability to make decisions with limited information is incredibly powerful. But it also comes with a huge downside. What information don't we have? And if we don't have that propensity to think about it, then there's a real risk that we start to make decisions, whether we're taking risk or trying to manage it, based on the wrong information. And this idea that our brain makes decisions based on the information it has a name. And it was conjured up by a gentleman called Daniel Kahneman. Now, he is a professor, he's a Nobel laureate, who wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I'm willing to bet that many of you have purchased this book, but you probably haven't already. And that's okay, because I'm here to help you avoid having to do that. It's not the most readable of books. And in the middle of it, Kahneman talks about this idea of what you see is all there is, or as he snappily abbreviates it, Wisiati. And this idea of Wisiati is what drives that human decision-making dynamic that I think is so dangerous from a risk perspective, and that we really need to understand. Now, what Kahneman says about Wisiati in the book is the following: it is the consistency of the information that matters for a good story, not its completeness. Indeed, you will often find that knowing little makes it easier to fit everything you know into a coherent pattern. In other words, ignorance is bliss. The less we know, the easier it is to make sense of the world. And because of that, we tend not to try and glean more information. The more information that we have to process, the harder our brains have to work. And the brain is a huge consumer of energy, so we try to avoid that. All of which means that we are naturally predisposed towards the data set that we have, rather than perhaps the data set that we should have. And this plays itself out into two different areas. Firstly, risk perception. How we see a particular risk, either as a risk taker or as a risk manager, can be heavily skewed. If we only think about what we know, that may mean that we miscalibrate the risks that are being taken. Either we underestimate them, or potentially we overestimate them because we don't have all of the facts. The second area where this becomes relevant is in risk communication. If we're going to talk to people about the sorts of risks that they're taking and the risk position of an organization, then we need to make sure that the information we're giving to people allows them to draw the right conclusion. In other words, if I'm a risk manager and I'm not presenting the full picture, I'm potentially giving a false impression because I know things that my audience might not, then there's a risk that they misunderstand the risk. So both when it comes to analyzing the risk from a risk taker or a risk manager's perspective, but also in terms of how we communicate and discuss that risk, this dynamic really matters. And in this presentation, what I'm going to do is take you on a Transfăgărășan lesson. Now, the Transfăgărășan highway is in Romania, and you can see a picture of it here. And the reason I like this is it makes us a really simple reminder. If we want to get people to be better at managing risk, then what we need to do is we need to work with that. We need to build this dynamic into our risk management program, just like the Transfăgărășan highway. We can't just build the road where we want it to be. We have to work with the dynamics of Mother Nature. We have to work with the way that people's brains operate. So once we know that what you see is all there are some things that we need to bear in mind as we design risk frameworks that can tolerate that sort of thinking, because it recognizes that's a natural component of the way we think. And so in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to pick just 5 dynamics that come off the back of WYSIWYATI, which is useful for you as a risk manager to have a think about each time you're trying to communicate or analyze risk. So the first dynamic that I wanted to highlight is the idea that first impressions count. And what I mean by that is that once we have an idea planted inside our heads, it can be very difficult to dislodge that idea, even if the information that we subsequently receive makes us perceive things differently. And here's a really good example from German television news. If you have a look at these two maps, they are showing you the number of recorded COVID cases. And if you looked at the dates, you would be forgiven for assuming that things had got materially worse. But hold on a second, have a look at the scale. And what you'll see is they've changed the color coding of the scale. In fact, what we're seeing here is a situation that is nowhere near as bad as first impressions would suggest. But once we get that into our heads, that's a really difficult thing to dislodge. A beautiful illustration of that as well comes through this Guardian advertisement from the 1980s. I'm going to let you watch a very short video. It's pretty self-explanatory, but again, it's this idea that we very quickly form opinions. And if we're not careful, those initial opinions can be the things that we stick with, even where we have contrarian information.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
The second dynamic driven by WYSIWYATI is that the data we have might not be the data we need, but our willingness to make decisions quickly means that we can sometimes miss that point. I want to take you back to some words from the former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who was famously ridiculed for a statement that he made about what we know and don't know. Rumsfeld said, "There are known knowns, things we know that we know. There are unknown unknowns, things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns, things we don't know we don't know." Now, people laughed at him at the time, but actually there's a lot of wisdom in what he says, because this idea of the unknown unknowns, things we're not even aware of, is a really good illustration of the way that our brains process data. It doesn't occur to us to think there might be something we're not aware of, and that can lead to some huge blind spots. Now, here's a really good example of not thinking about data that you don't have from the Second World War. Abraham Wald was a mathematician who was hired by the US Air Force to help them do risk management. And one of the challenges facing the Air Force was that they were losing lots of planes. So they decided to take a look at the planes that were coming back and see where those were most vulnerable. And they identified, as this illustration shows, that there were various locations on the planes that were riddled with bullet holes. So the idea that they came up with was they were going to fix those bits of the aircraft. Those were obviously the vulnerable bits of the plane that needed protecting. And Wald stepped in and pointed out something really important to them. And that was the fact that the data set they were looking at was just the planes that had returned. For obvious reasons, they weren't able to look at the planes that hadn't returned. And what he said was, actually, these points where your planes have been hit aren't weak points, they're actually strong points. And therefore, these are the bits of the plane that you can afford to get hit in and still make it back. What you need to do is strengthen the bits of the plane that haven't been hit on these aircraft, because those are the things that appear to be the weaknesses. So what Wald was doing was identifying the data set that wasn't available, the planes that hadn't made it back, and recognizing what the data he had was telling him and what the data he didn't have might be telling him. As a result, they followed Wald's advice, and the number of aircraft making it back increased substantially. It was a really smart illustration that if you don't think about the data sets you don't have, you can easily draw the wrong conclusion. If you want to find out more about Wald and similar stories, I recommend this book by Jordan Ellenberg, who uncovers all sorts of interesting use of maths in everyday life. So that's the second point, is the data we have might not be the data that we need. Which brings us neatly onto the third dynamic. The third dynamic I want to highlight is that what you see might not be what I see, by which I mean our own individual perspective on things might not be the same as other people's perspective. And I'll start with this really simple illustration of a speaker that is often confused by people for a trash can. It's an understandable mistake if you don't know what the word Bose means. If you know what Bose means, there's a high likelihood that you will realize that a speaker company is unlikely to make trash cans. But if you've never heard that word before, your perspective on what this thing that you're looking at is may be very, very different. And it's obvious from the fact that there's a sign that lots of people have made this mistake before. Whoever was designing the speaker clearly wasn't contemplating that it would be put in a location where people might confuse it. And yet, if somebody comes along and is looking for a trash can, there is a strong likelihood that if something seems to be like a trash can, it's in a location where you'd expect it, then perhaps it might be one. And that's, of course, a small, silly example, but here's a more serious one. This comes from the City of London, which is the financial district here where I am in London. And they had a major problem with people dropping cigarette butts. So they did what they thought was a logical thing, which was to put signs up telling people about the scale of the problem. They detailed the size of it, how much it cost them to clean up, and the fact that this was a major issue. Really good idea from the perspective of the City of London. Let's share the scale of the problem and hope that people behave differently. But in reality, this campaign completely failed. And there's a really simple reason why. And that is that if you are somebody who smokes, the message that these boards send out isn't don't do this, but is actually very, very different. It sends you a message that lots of people are doing it. And because the scale of the problem is so large, actually your little contribution, your few cigarette butts, aren't going to make much difference at all. There must be so many people doing this for it to cost that much money to clean up. And so far from signaling that people shouldn't do it, what it actually does is subliminally signals to people that it's okay to drop cigarette butts because everybody else is doing it. Really good example of unintended consequences. And I've got to tell you the story involving Barbra Streisand, yes, the US singer, because she did something really interesting, or rather her lawyers did something really interesting. When somebody decided to take shots of the California coastline for geological purposes and put these on the internet, in other words, they went up and down the coastline and filmed everything that you could see. Streisand was a little bit unhappy because her house was located on that coastline. And so her lawyers moved to have the image in which you could see her house removed from the web. Now, as you can see here, you can't actually see that much. And of course, people in general aren't looking at the coastline. They wouldn't be looking at this geological website with a view to spying on stars. And what happened was, because Streisand's lawyers highlighted this fact, because they started the law case, lots more people became aware that her house was visible. And the number of views skyrocketed, not because people were interested, but purely because the lawsuit had highlighted something that people weren't aware of. The data set that Streisand's lawyers were operating on, which is we can see her house, wasn't the same data set that everybody else was operating under. So looking at things through the wrong perspective resulted in precisely the outcome they weren't looking for. They wanted to keep their client's property secret. Actually, they ended up exposing it much more. It's led to something called the Streisand effect, which is where if you want to stop people from doing something or not think about something, one of the things that is worth avoiding is highlighting that fact. So sometimes bad publicity comes from the fact that you highlight something that people might not have been aware of otherwise. So some classic examples are there of what you see may not be what I see. The fourth dynamic that I want to highlight is that past experience might be of little value. Now, notice the word might. Sometimes past experience can be incredibly valuable. If we have experienced something and then experience the same thing again, it can be incredibly useful because we know how to handle it. The trouble is that in many situations we come across things that we might not have handled before, or that feel like something we've handled before but actually aren't. And a good example of that would be in how many governments responded to COVID. Now, Jeremy Hunt, no relation, is a former UK health minister. And he went on the record saying, "We need to find ways to challenge the groupthink that meant we thought we were all fine because we prepared for pandemic flu when actually we needed to be thinking about pandemic SARS." It's a really good illustration of the fact that many governments, particularly those in countries that had not experienced pandemics before, were either ill-prepared and or they reached for a playbook that they thought was appropriate. The trouble is, if your playbook is for flu and what you're facing is COVID, then that's entirely the wrong playbook. And here is a really simple illustration of how past experience, past preparation, work and effort engaged in preparing for something may sometimes not be useful, because actually the experience that we've put in, the time and the effort, may not have produced results that are relevant for the situation that we're in. Now, sometimes past experience or knowledge is relevant, but we just don't realize it. We draw the wrong lessons from it. And so here's a really good example. In Indonesia, they are currently building something which has been nicknamed Jurassic Park for Komodo dragons. Now, if you don't know what a Komodo dragon is, it's here on the screen at the moment. They are incredibly large, highly dangerous animals. They can easily cause injury and death to human beings. It's not the kind of animal that you want to be in close proximity with. And so the idea that they are building a theme park has been nicknamed Jurassic Park. And it's been called that because many of the dynamics that people observe are similar to that you can see in the Jurassic Park movie or read in the Jurassic Park book. And you can see from on screen here that there have already been some of the things that happened in the movie and the book happening in real life. Workers at the park have been seriously injured. And you might say, well, okay, that's not fair to compare it with Jurassic Park because this is a different thing. And maybe they hadn't heard of Jurassic Park until I show you this. This is the imagery that the architects have produced, and you'll recognize that it looks incredibly close to what we're seeing in Jurassic Park. What's even worse is that in one of the promotional videos put out to promote the park that showed these designs, they actually used the theme music from Jurassic Park, thereby illustrating that they were aware of the movie and the book, but that they hadn't learned a single lesson from it. So when we think of past experience, it's very difficult sometimes for us to either know which bits of past experience are relevant and which bits are not. So we may well ignore experiences that are incredibly relevant to the situation we're in, or alternatively, ignore those and focus on ones that really aren't relevant, as we have seen with COVID. So past experience can be incredibly valuable, but if we're not careful, we can quickly jump to using the wrong kind of past experience to determine our future risk management strategy, and that can have terrible consequences. The final dynamic that I want to highlight is the most difficult one for me to mention, and that is because this is a warning to you, because all of the things that we've covered so far sound pretty bad, but actually things are much, much worse than you might think. And that is because there are dynamics afoot that make this even more challenging than you might initially think. The first dynamic that makes it challenging is technology. And you can see on the screen now a classic story. This was from Denver in Colorado, where lots and lots of people decided to follow their GPS unit. They got stuck in a traffic jam and thought GPS could lead them to the airport. Unfortunately, the GPS they were using was Google Maps. That had an error in it, and lots of people found themselves stuck on a path. This is a really good illustration how our dependency on technology makes us even more vulnerable to some of the dynamics that are there before, because technology gives us a degree of safety and comfort that might not sometimes be warranted. And people often talk about algorithms and saying that algorithms are good because they don't make the sorts of mistakes that people make, which is quite true, except when the algorithm is deployed in a situation where it's not relevant. The thing that we talked about people doing can also happen because people program machines. And here's an example from Uber, where they have this surge pricing mechanism that kicks in whenever demand exceeds supply. Basic idea being that if lots of people want to have a ride, they will put the price up. That will encourage more drivers out onto the road, and it will also price out a certain number of riders, thereby ensuring that if somebody wants a ride, they can get one, albeit at a higher price. You might not like it, but it works on basic economic principles, and it's very effective at doing what it should do, except when it isn't. And the time when it isn't is when something has happened whereby it would be economically smart to charge a premium. But actually, from a societal or social or customer services perspective, that doesn't make sense. So, for example, if there's a natural disaster or if there is a terrorist incident, you wouldn't want to have your price hiked up because lots of people are trying to flee from it. And that's what Uber has had happen in the past. And so what they've had to do now is to intervene, to have humans overseeing what the algorithm is doing, so that if it is kicking in a way that is inappropriate, they can supersede that. And what this illustrates is that the dynamics we talked about can be exacerbated purely because technology doesn't think in the way that human beings do. So humans will put brakes on things, machines won't, unless they're programmed to do that. So really good illustration of how machines scale up this particular risk. And there's a final thing that I want to highlight to you, which is a fabulous book called Invisible Women. And what this book highlights is that many of the things that we use in society for understandable historical reasons are based around men. So protective clothing is based around the male body, crash test dummies in vehicles are based around the male body, and so on and so forth. And we all recognize words like chairman that have historically assumed that a man would be sitting in the chair controlling things. So in a patriarchal society, one of the real risks here is that we have designed things in a particular way based on a set of presumptions. And these are so ingrained in us that it's actually sometimes difficult to disaggregate that. Even women can find themselves defaulting to thinking about the world through a male lens because that's all they're used to. So I highly recommend, if you haven't come across Invisible Women, that you take a read of this book. It is absolutely shocking and highly revealing. And what it exposes is one of the factors that we often forget, The world is sometimes designed by people with inbuilt presumptions that may not be correct. And the reason this is particularly dangerous for us is that we may not be able to spot it. We may just accept it as the way things are done and continue to do that. Think about your keyboard. It's the world's worst input device, and yet we persist with it. It was originally designed for typewriters, and it was deliberately designed to slow people down as they were typing. Really good illustration of something that may have made sense once upon a time. Certainly doesn't now, but we are kind of stuck with it. And what Invisible Women exposes is that not only are these things visible to us, but there are a ton more that are invisible. So sadly, my parting shot for this particular session is that not only do all of the dynamics that we've talked about apply, but it's actually far, far worse than you might think. So with all of that said, thank you so much for watching this video. Look out for this really key dynamic. Whizzy-atty, what you see is all there is. Before I leave you, there's just enough time to recap the 5 things that we went through. So when we think about what you see is all there is, the first dynamic to remember is that first impressions count. What we see initially can drive the way we look at things. So once we've made our mind up about something, it can be very difficult to shift that. We will jump to conclusions quickly based on the data that's there. The second is that the data we have might not be the data we need. Remember, we can make decisions based on what's there really simply, so we don't think to look for alternatives. We may not be looking for the weaknesses in what's in front of us. Very important then, when you're making decisions based on a data set, to also think about what it might not be telling you, what alternative data sources might there be, and how could we look at this challenge slightly differently. If we think about the weaknesses of what's in front of us, we can potentially identify some new data sources that might be of higher quality when it comes to making this decision. The third dynamic is what you see might not be what I see. I may see a trash can where you see a speaker. Remember, very, very easy for us to think about things from our perspective, not think about things from the perspective of other people. That means we might misjudge situations, but equally when we're communicating about risk to other people, we may give the wrong impression inadvertently. Don't assume that what other people are thinking is what we're thinking, and vice versa. The fourth dynamic is that past experience might be of little value. We're always tempted to believe that the things we have experienced are highly relevant to the situation we're in now. That can be incredibly useful when we have no other reference points. But in a changing world, we may well make presumptions based on what we've seen before that turn out to be completely flawed. If we think the world isn't changing, we will make decisions based on dynamics that are no longer relevant. Incredibly important then to ask when we are relying on past experience, where that past experience might not be relevant. What could be different about this particular situation that means we need to think about it slightly differently, and the presumptions that we've made about the past are no longer valid. That was shown very, very clearly in COVID, but there are lots of other examples where rules that used to apply no longer apply, dynamics that used to apply no longer apply, and we need to think about things differently. Leaning on the past can be very valuable, but it can also be very dangerous. And then finally, remember I said this is much, much worse than you think. Why? Well, because technology is changing many of the dynamics that are there. It is scaling us all up, giving us all capabilities to make situations far, far worse. Pressing buttons on our keyboard gives us a tremendous amount of power. That can be incredibly dangerous. If you have a look at social media and the way fake news can be spread that way, there's a really good indication of the power of technology. And as I also explained, we've got lots of preconceptions, things built into systems and structures that might not necessarily produce the best outcomes. We talked about invisible women, this idea that we live in a male-dominated society. Now, we tend to think about that in terms of roles that people fulfill, but we also highlighted the fact that things like bulletproof vests, which of course you would want to be as universal as possible, very heavily defined by the male body. And for those reasons, we've got lots of structures that may not necessarily lend themselves to being best at managing risk in the world going forward. And if we just depend on those historic structures, assuming that because things have been around for a long time, then we run the risk of causing further problems down the line. We need to recognize the weaknesses of the structures and processes that we have in place. So with all of that said, thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to ask any questions, there's an opportunity to do that through the platform. I'm really grateful that you've spent this time with me. Please feel absolutely free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can just search for the words human risk on LinkedIn and you will find me there and find details of things like my newsletter and my podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. I wish you all the best for the rest of Risk Awareness Week 2021 and beyond. Thanks for watching.